This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Hi, my name is Pamela Fuselli, and I'm the host of Popping the Bubble Wrap. Are you the person in your family who worries about the safety of others, about buying safety products and using them? Are you yelling, "Yes, that's me"? This is the podcast for you. Raising a child or children can be a hair-raising undertaking, and keeping them safe is a priority. Parachute's Popping the Bubble Wrap podcast explores what you really need to think about as a parent or caregiver, and provides easy tips on prevention strategies. No bubble wrap here, though. Stay in a dark room. Wake them up every hour. Absolutely no screen time. These are outdated pieces of advice that are still being offered about concussion. Researchers and experts know infinitely more about concussion than they did just 10 years ago. But is that information getting through to parents? Do they know what they really need to know about concussion? Hello, Adam, Heather, and Jenna. Thanks for being part of Parachute's Popping the Bubble Wrap podcast.
Thanks for having us.
We're talking about concussions today, and there is a lot more that we know. Concussions are fairly common. A conservative estimate is that there's 250,000 concussions sustained every year in Canada. So a lot of them resolve in a couple of weeks without challenges or without complications. Thankfully, there are some that do continue. What experiences have you had with concussion? And Adam, maybe we'll start with you.
So my son is 12. He started playing organized hockey at 5. By 6, he was playing rep hockey. And so the discussion of concussions was not uncommon, just because hockey is a contact sport. It's physical. And generally speaking, the coaches just said, if we see something that we suspect might be a concussion, we'll take them off the ice. And, you'll do what you need to do in terms of consulting with a doctor or, in a worst case scenario, hospital. Fortunately, up until recently, my son had never sustained one. However, this summer, we sent him to hockey camp for a week. And the second day of camp, I picked him up from camp. And at the end of the day, he didn't tell me anything about what went on at camp during the day, but he was in a very off mood when I picked him up. He looked exhausted. And he also looked, and this is very uncharacteristic from him, I would say he actually looked kind of sad, like just down. So I asked him if everything's okay. And he said, I don't feel so well. Do you mind if I don't go to swimming tonight? I said, sure. Don't go to swimming. When we go home, just take it easy and we'll have a relaxing night. Well, I took him home. We arrived home around 4:30. He fell asleep and he woke up at 8:30. And when he woke up, he vomited. That's unusual. Like, he's not someone who vomits unless he's like incredibly sick. At the time, though, it didn't click in my own head because no one said anything to me at the camp and he didn't tell me anything. He said he felt a little bit better after vomiting. I said, do you want anything to eat? Maybe you should hydrate a little bit. He drank a little bit of water. And then shortly thereafter, he fell back asleep. He ended up sleeping for another 12 hours. Now, I know teenagers sleep a long time, but that is unheard of. I mean, altogether, he slept 16 hours. So in the morning, when he got up, at that point now, my suspicion had turned into more than suspicion. So I asked him, okay, what happened at camp yesterday? You were really off when I picked you up. You just slept 16 hours. You vomited. To me, from what I know, it looks like you've got a concussion. And he said, well, yeah, I didn't tell you this, but yesterday I bumped into another kid. And when I bumped into him, I fell backwards and hit my head on the ice. Now, obviously, they're wearing helmets. Mm-hmm. And I asked him something that I thought was important to ask. I said, did any of the staff see it? He says, yeah. Not only did one staff member see it, he said there were about 4 of them, including the owner of the camp. So what was troubling for me was that no one said anything to me when I picked him up at the end of camp. And so that morning, obviously, we took him to the pediatrician. He said he had a concussion. But I went to the camp at the end of the day. I was upset, but I was reasonable. And I explained to them, what happened, that he'd been officially diagnosed with what they said was a concussion, not a major one, but a concussion nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked the director of the camp, who was also the owner, why didn't you say anything to me about him falling? He told me that you saw him. And I asked him, did you see him? So he didn't deny anything. I was kind of sort of curious to see how he would handle it. He said, no, in fact, there were about 3 or 4 of us that were around. We saw him fall, and he got right back up and finished his shift. And we said to him, are you okay? And he said, yeah, I'm fine. He just went on. Now that to me, that's something that bothered me, because if someone has a concussion, they don't necessarily know it, especially
Right.
a 12-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also they did ask him if he was all right, and he just sort of brushed them off. But I mean, the fact that they even thought, in my opinion, to ask him, are you okay, to me means that they must have thought something was off. I mean, if you see a kid fall backwards on the ice and hit their head, the chances that there might be a concussion are a little bit higher than if he didn't hit his head on the ice.
Well, interesting you say that, because Parachute has done a campaign around checking for concussions, and we've sort of approached it like, if you have to ask, you have to check. So if you have to ask if they're okay, you should check if there's a need, if there's been a concussion sustained. So how you've phrased it is very much in line with some of the messaging that we have.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, but needless to say, I was disappointed even that they didn't, not just that they didn't inform me, that they didn't put an incident report. And, the director had explained to me that he had 25 years of coaching experience. And he said to me, this is what he said: look, when a kid has a concussion, it's usually pretty obvious. They're crying, or they have trouble getting off the ice, and they need help. They're just really out of sorts. Your son finished his shift. I have no reason to believe he had a concussion. Mm. And, that's just, I mean, I don't know the research. I'm sure, Pam, you would know it better than me. That's not good enough. And I said that to him, and I was polite and whatnot, but I said that, look, you should have at least, at the very least, told me when I picked him up. You should have recorded it as an incident that a kid fell and hit his ice. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to report that when we took him to the physician, what he said was that, and it's funny how you're talking about like old school thinking. I cannot tell you, and obviously I shared this with a lot of friends, what happened. Everyone was, oh my God, how did you let him sleep? Are you crazy? Everyone got on me about letting him sleep for the 16 hours. That's such a misconception. All the doctor said to us was that for the next 10 days, he should not be in a situation where there could be possible trauma to the head. Mm-hmm. And more or less that he should take it easy. He did mention that if his symptoms worsened, that would be a concern, and then you take him to the hospital. But if the symptoms do not, then after those 10 days, and he also didn't say to take him out of any activity. He just said activities where his head would be in danger. So obviously he did not continue with the hockey camp. He basically took the rest of the week off, and then the next week he went back to the other camp that we had him sign up for.
Yeah, and Heather, what Adam's describing is, I think, a challenge for parents, but also coaches and people running camps and physicians in staying up to date on the latest and greatest in terms of what you should or shouldn't do. Do you feel equipped to know what to do? And what's your response when your child does hit their head?
It's really interesting that you asked that when you were doing the opening and mentioning, that a lot of the information is about 10 years old. I'm thinking, well, that makes sense to me because my kids are 10 and 14, and they very much, they had a lot of head injury issues when they were infants and toddlers. And so I'm like, yeah, that's how old my information is. Okay, I'm out of date. I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad I'm going to learn. I'm very grateful that my kids aren't in sports that have a high risk of concussions. I don't think my nerves could handle it. But when both of my kids were very, very, very active when they were little, and I think we probably ended up in the ER 3 or 4 times for them, falling off of something and hitting their head, or kicking over their chair and hitting their head. We lived in basement suites, so it was always cement floors. And we got to know really quickly when, like Adam said, if they're vomiting, things like that, we knew the signs really quickly. But our information was still very much the wake them up every hour, don't let them sleep too long, check their pupils, don't let them be on screens. Like all of that was very much the information that we got.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to get information out to everybody who needs it. But there's various places where we know the information is current and up to date. And I think the good news is that we're finding that, return to activity that doesn't make the symptoms worse, not sitting in a dark room for 3 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever time that is, that it's actually the instructions now, or the what we know from research is that it's actually a much healthier way to recover from a concussion. Jenna, with your twin boys and your daughter, what's your response when they hit their heads? And is this kind of information that you're thinking that you may not know enough about in terms of what to do now?
I would say that's exactly it. Like Heather, I'm going, oh, this is really good. This is good. I'm not sure that I knew that already. We've been pretty lucky in terms of hitting our heads with our kids. We've had a lot of odd issues in our family, but thankfully the heads have been pretty good so far. I have a few medical professionals in my friends and family circle, and that's always kind of my personal safety net of going, okay, I might not know what the answer is, but I know who I'd asked, who I know is up on the latest research, not just what's going to pop up first on a search engine online, or what my parents might say if I called them, or even what I did, because I had a mild concussion years ago. And, even, things that I was told to do and how I reacted to it is not necessarily what the research would say I should do with my kids now if one of them had them. But I think that's kind of an important point for parents to keep in mind too, that it's not just the risk factor isn't just with contact sports. Obviously, we know there are risk factors with those. And yes, you hope that you have coaches and everyone who are up to date on things. But just as parents, my mild concussion came from moving furniture. I hit my head against, the arm of the couch in just a very certain way that, it did impact me for a couple of days. And so, it could be very easy for a kid at any age to, slip on the ice and hit their head in a driveway, not necessarily because they're playing hockey. So I think it's really helpful for all of us to constantly have these kind of reminders of, especially when things are progressing and we're understanding new things, like, you don't have to go back to those old, the old way of doing things of staying in a dark room and off screens, unless, screens are impacting what you're doing.
Yeah. With youth, sport is often the place where they do sustain a concussion, but you're right. You can get a concussion from being in a motor vehicle crash, or falling, like you said, falling in on the ice. And, I knew a woman who walked into this door of a cabinet that was open and had a concussion. So, you're right. It's not just sport. But when we think about youth, especially, that's where a lot of the concussion injuries come from. And you don't even have to hit your head to have a concussion. It's the brain moving inside your skull. So even if your body is hit, you don't necessarily have to have hit your head to have a concussion. And Adam, your son, his response is very common. I'm sure there's parents thinking, yes, that's exactly what happened to me, because you think about us individually as, even as adults, your first response when you fall or when you get hurt is like, get up, nobody notice. Nothing to see here kind of thing. That's why it's so important for the people around, to be able to say something if they see something. So I think your message about that, report it, tell somebody, because the earlier that you diagnose a concussion, the better, because the treatment or the steps can be taken so that it's not, it doesn't get any worse.
I'll admit that I felt guilty that I didn't sort of make the inference earlier, but in retrospect, I mean, he didn't say anything to me either, right? He didn't mention that he fell until the following morning. But still, I think it's the responsibility of the people on the ice to obviously be alert and pay attention to that. And had he not said anything to me about what happened on the ice, if I hadn't sort of asked enough probing questions, I don't even know if he would have necessarily known. Although symptomatically, it obviously seemed that way. But if I didn't ask what happened at camp specifically, I'm not sure he would have said anything. So I got over my guilt. But I will just sort of reiterate that point. I cannot tell you how many people admonished me for letting him sleep. That misconception is very widespread still.
Absolutely. And we have to, I think what the message here for us as an organization is that we're trying to get this information out and into the hands of public so that we replace that as strongly as it's embedded right now, that that is not the way to treat a concussion. So thank you all for sharing your stories, for sharing your personal experiences, and just leave everyone with, if you have to ask, you have to check if there's been a concussion. So thanks, everybody. Concussion info on the go. Parachute's Concussion Ed app is designed to give you access to trusted concussion information anytime, anywhere. Visit parachute.ca/concussion and download Concussion Ed for free in the App Store and Google Play Store.
It's time to open your parachute.
Stephanie Cowell is Parachute's Director Knowledge Translation, and she has spent more than a decade working in the area of injury prevention and trauma prevention. You are an expert in concussions, Stephanie. What did you hear from our parent discussion that was interesting, different maybe? And tell us a little bit about, your experience with concussion.
Yeah. Hi, Pam. Thanks for having me. It was interesting to hear the discussion because, unfortunately, the story that we heard from Adam is quite a familiar one. It's one that we're working very hard to change with a lot of partners across the country and indeed around the world. This idea that perhaps concussions aren't recognized and treated with seriousness, particularly maybe in the youth sport world. And that we need to create change there, that, signs and symptoms after an incident should be taken seriously. There needs to be communication between coaches, their participants, the officials, parents, all those around them, around any health and safety issue regarding children. So, the story that Adam told, unfortunately, we have heard before. I think in this case, we had a fairly positive outcome. It sounds like, like many people, Adam's child recovered within a reasonable amount of time. That is the most common scenario. But we have heard of really unfortunate consequences of this type of situation before. Which is why it's so important that we learn more about concussion and have more communication about this topic.
Yeah, I think I'm continually surprised when I do hear people tell me stories about. I kind of understand other parents or the general public not necessarily being up on what are the most recent recommendations around concussion recognition, but to hear that. Some medical people also are not keeping up to date on concussion recommendations, that stay in the dark room, wake them up every hour on the hour. I remember as a kid, that was top of mind. If you got a hit to the head, it was, wake them up every 30 minutes. Don't let them sleep too long. And we know it changes, but it's not that quickly. So there's there's some challenges for us to get that information out into the public quickly enough so that new learnings and new tips on, what you should do are embedded as solidly as those ones that we continue to hear that are no longer recommended.
Yeah, information is changing so much in this particular area because we're focused on and learning so much more about the human brain, which is still so much a mystery, even with all that we've gained. There have been some really important learnings in the last, decade or so. One of them being around recognition that you don't have to get knocked out. You don't have to have a specific number and set of symptoms to be, suspected of having a concussion. So it is important for all of us to be aware of the common signs and symptoms to look out for with concussion. And just one sign or symptom is enough. So just a headache or just feeling dizzy or just feeling not quite right after an impact is enough to get a concussion checked out by a medical professional. And some of the things you discussed that have changed around, we're not recommending that people sit in a dark room. Not only is that not beneficial, but we've actually learned that can cause harm, that can delay recovery, create anxiety, create depression and isolation. So the way that these are dealt with now with, yes, some time off, yes, rest is good for the brain, but so is gradual returns to activities in a responsible and safe and very individualized way. These are important considerations. So, the tough part about hearing about people still giving, outdated information or recommendations is as people that work in the area, we do know that there's lots of good quality resources out there, and it's a matter of making that connection for people. So, whether it's through websites or podcasts or apps or free trainings, there's so much good information across Canada right now that's evidence-based and free and easy to access if we can really connect people with that information.
And the youth, when we look at the youth population, older children and youth, a lot of the concussions will come from sports. For younger kids, those that aren't necessarily, that are more toddlers and younger children, they are, as every parent knows, they're top heavy. They have, their heads in proportion to their size overall is much bigger. They are going to hit their heads. What are some of the common signs and symptoms that parents should be looking for, whether it's a sport-related concussion or another cause?
Yeah, you're so right, Pam. If we look at the physiology of children, their head is so much bigger in proportion to their body than adults. So they are prone to tip and fall like little penguins. Kids are fascinating because in some ways they're so much more resilient, including their brains, but in others they are more vulnerable. And so when we look at causes of concussion in younger children, it is typically falling over. Even in sport, it's much more likely to be them kind of maybe colliding with another kid because they're running around, as opposed to being hit by an object or some of the other more kind of skill and game-based ways that older athletes are injured. There's really common symptoms for anyone who sustains a concussion. Headache is the most commonly reported symptom. There's other things like feeling dizzy, feeling off, sensitivity to light and sound. And there are, lists and recognition tools. You don't have to memorize this information, but it's good to be aware of some of the really common ones. But even, young children who tend to fall as they explore and hit their heads. What if they're not talking yet? Or what if they can't quite explain emotions? Or even if you have an older child who maybe communicates non-verbally, what are some of the things to watch out for? And really the way we describe it is after some sort of impact, or if they hit their head or fall down really hard where their head gets, shaken, watch for changes in your child. So children with a head injury, they might not be feeding the same way. They may not be interested in their toys the same way. They might be more emotional than usual for them You might say, my kid is always upset. Well, if that's normal for them, okay. But if something's just not quite right, that's where the antenna go up, and it's good to look further into the situation. So we can look for behavioral cues. We can look at how they're sleeping, all these little different components to see if something's just not quite right after a hit.
Really important information for parents that it just touches the tip of the proverbial iceberg of the information that is out there. And of course, on our website, we have a lot of really good resources for parents that, as you say, they don't need to memorize these things because it is a lot of information. And to keep track of it in your mind, is it this or is it that? So there's resources out there that are sort of on the go, like our Concussion Ed Up, or resources on our website that parents and coaches and teachers can download. So thanks for sharing these tips and information on the podcast. And I know the listeners will be very interested in hearing this, and hopefully we'll go and find more information so that we can get the word out on what are the things that really need to be done if you suspect a concussion. And the good news, I think, that you shared is it isn't withholding daily life. It is a gradual return to activity and not isolating the person. So that hopefully will decrease the hesitancy for people to identify or say, hey, maybe I've had a concussion and I need to get it checked out.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to inform and use knowledge to really reduce anxiety and just empower people to feel informed and know what to watch for and what to do. And the rest is in the hands of those health professionals. We don't all need to be doctors, but we can be informed and advocate for our kids.
Great. Thanks for joining me, Steph.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Popping the Bubble Wrap is a podcast of Parachute, Canada's national injury prevention charity, whose mission is for Canadians to live long lives to the fullest by preventing serious and fatal injuries. We release episodes every 2 weeks. On the next episode, we'll be talking about hot tips for cool kids. What are the causes of serious burns in our homes? Help us reach parents and caregivers by sharing this link with your friends and family and giving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Popping the Bubble Wrap is produced for Parachute by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.
This is Story Studio Network.